A Window Above a Stage, Oakland, California, August 1972. A man is standing behind that window with a telephoto lens and 3 rolls of high-speed film watching a puppet show he was never invited to record. Years later, he'd describe himself, without irony, as the Lee Harvey Oswald of the puppet set. Except I wasn't going to kill Frank. He is not a puppeteer. He has never performed. The bag at his feet holds a portfolio of tractors and airplane cabins, the resume of an industrial designer, not an entertainer. Nearly 50 years later, a different photograph hangs in his house. Him, Gonzo, and Peter Sellers in full Inspector Clouseau costume. Nobody looking at that photo would guess what it has to do with a window in Oakland. We'll get there. 4 years after that window, this man will be handed the most recognizable failure-shaped nose in television history. He will build a puppet that becomes his own likeness and put it on a shelf in his living room. And 50 years later, after one of the 3 hands that ever performed his most famous character has died, after Kermit has been performed by 3 different men, after almost every original Muppeteer has either passed away or been quietly, publicly separated from the company, this man will be the answer to a very specific question. How does a man who designed airplane cabins become, half a century later, the only person who has never once lost his own Muppet? Not through a company decision, not through a health scare, not through death, just never. This is Dave Goelz. He has no acting training, no puppetry background. What he has, standing outside that Oakland window, is a stack of drawings for things nobody has ever called art. Chapter 1. Before Henson. Before he ever put a hand inside a puppet on camera, Dave Goelz spent his life designing things nobody would ever think to call art. David Charles Goelz was born on July 16, 1946 in the Los Angeles area. At 5 years old, he was already obsessed with puppets, specifically Howdy Doody, enough that his parents helped him buy a marionette of his own. Around the same age, he fell for Time for Beanie, Bob Clampett, and Stan Freberg's scrappy hand puppet show. By 13, he'd built his own puppet theater with a stage his father constructed for him, running shows with a friend named Eddie Paul, charging the neighborhood kids 10 cents a ticket. As a kid, he even landed a walk-on as an extra in Disney's The Parent Trap in 1961, a small, strange bit of foreshadowing. Nobody in the theater that day could have understood. But when it came time to choose a career, Goelz didn't chase puppetry. He went to the LA Art Center College of Design and trained as an industrial designer, the discipline of shaping the objects people touch every day without ever thinking about who designed them. His first job was at Henry Dreyfuss and Associates, one of the most respected industrial design firms in the country, working on products for clients like John Deere and Polaroid and contributing to cabin interior work for American Airlines. From there, he moved to Hewlett-Packard in Silicon Valley, where for roughly 3.5 years he helped design precision measurement instruments, including laser interferometers, not exactly the resume of a future television icon. Somewhere in there, he was also briefly in the military and later became a conscientious objector, a detail that sounds like a footnote now. Hold on to it. It becomes the emotional foundation of a completely different character, much later in a different country, on a completely different kind of set. It was Sesame Street, not show business in general, but specifically the design of Sesame Street's puppets that pulled Goelz's attention back toward puppetry as an adult. He wasn't drawn in by the performing, he was drawn in the way an engineer is drawn to a beautifully solved problem. This is the toolkit he's carrying into that window in Oakland. Tractors, airplane cabins, laser instruments, and a lifelong, quietly held fascination with puppets he'd never actually gotten to build professionally. That toolkit is about to become the strangest job application in the history of children's television. Chapter 2. The Detour Through the Workbench, 1972 to 1976. The plan was never to become a professional puppeteer. The plan was one unpaid vacation day. On August 15, 1972, Dave Goelz took a day off to attend the Puppeteers of America National Convention at Mills College in Oakland. Frank Oz was performing. Goelz didn't walk up and introduce himself. He watched from a window above the stage, telephoto lens in hand, 3 rolls of high-speed film, close enough to study technique, but too intimidated to make contact. That's the moment behind his own joke about Lee Harvey Oswald. That fall, a business trip to Pennsylvania gave him an excuse to spend an extra week in New York on vacation. Every day that week, he showed up at Reeves Teletape Studios on 81st and Broadway to watch Sesame Street being filmed, bringing along puppets he'd built himself, hoping somebody would notice. Somebody did. Bonnie Erickson, who ran the Muppet Workshop, saw what he'd brought and encouraged him to reach out to Jim Henson directly. Henson himself was out of the country at the time, at a Unima puppetry conference in France. And then one day back in California, the phone rang. "Hi there, this is Jim Henson." Goelz's own recollection of his reaction amounts to something close to disbelief. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to a man he'd only ever watched from a distance. They arranged to meet in Los Angeles on the sidelines of Henson's appearance on the Perry Como Show. Goelz brought his entire industrial design portfolio, cameras, light switches, tractors, airplane interiors, and saved for last, the puppets he'd built himself. Not a resume built for show business, a resume built to prove he could design and build things that worked. It worked. In 1973, Goelz became a part-time puppet builder for Henson Associates. His first assignment was for a planned Broadway show. That fell through, and he ended up working on the ABC pilot The Muppets Valentine Show instead, where his very first on-camera performing role was a minor character named Brewster. Then came a setback. Goelz went back to California and, in his absence, lost his old day job, so he started his own small business building puppets for industrial clients, including a promotional character called Ray the Rake'em Seal. Not exactly Sesame Street. In the fall of 1974, Henson made him an offer that solved everything. A full-time position as a designer and builder, with occasional performing work, while letting Goelz keep his California-based client relationships going on the side. Goelz's own description of the deal amounts to, "How could I say no?" Over the next 2 years working out of the Muppet Workshop, Goelz built characters that would go on to become fixtures of American television. Nigel, the never-quite-launched original host character from the pilot era. Zoot, the perpetually half-asleep saxophonist. Animal, Floyd Pepper. He was at this point purely a builder with occasional performing duties. Not yet the face or the hand behind any single defining character. 2 years into building other people's characters, still with no defining role of his own. If you're the kind of person who roots for the guy in the workshop instead of the guy on stage, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because the next 50 years of this story are about to become his. That changed in 1976. Henson handed him a sad-eyed, bent-nosed puppet that had been sitting in storage in New York and said 4 words: "This could be Gonzo." What happened next? The fear, the little dark frightened character of Season 1, the single word that changed everything. That's a story we've already told in full, in its own video. If you haven't seen it, it's genuinely worth your time. It's one of the strangest, most human origin stories in the entire franchise. Here, we're doing something different. Here, the story isn't about what happened to one character. It's about the man who spent the next 50 years building and keeping 9 more. Chapter 3. One performer, many characters. While one character belonged to him publicly, 4 more already secretly belonged to him from the workshop floor. The Dr. Bunsen Honeydew, the show's gloriously unethical scientist, first appeared around 1975 to 76, designed and built by Goelz himself. The puppet's design was reportedly modeled in part on the show's real-life producer, Lou Grade. A little inside joke from the workshop. Zoot was Goelz's first major-built character, the saxophonist for Dr. Teeth and the Electric Mayhem, a running joke of a character defined almost entirely by looking perpetually checked out, half asleep behind sunglasses that never quite seem necessary indoors. Beauregard, the Muppet Theater's good-natured, none-too-bright janitor, is one Goelz has spoken about with real affection, specifically for the character's uncomplicated, dog-like loyalty. "I feel that way about Bo," Goelz said. "Oh, see, I even spell it the way he does." And Nigel, The original, ultimately abandoned show host character from the pilot Special Sex and Violence in 1975 was also a Goelz build, a Muppet that essentially got replaced by the format itself before the series ever launched. 4 characters, 1 workshop, 1 performer, quietly building an ensemble around the edges of the show while Gonzo got the screen time. Chapter 4. The Movies. Television made him recognizable, but the most dangerous stunts of his career happened once the cameras moved outdoors. The Muppet Movie, 1979, gave Goelz one of the most technically demanding sequences of his career, the balloon flight performed with a radio-controlled Gonzo puppet, Goelz operating the head and mouth movements remotely from a distance. It's also worth noting, as a strange bit of trivia, in the film's closing credits, Goelz is the only principal Muppet performer credited in the design section rather than the performing section, a small leftover from the fact that he'd originally been hired as a designer, not a performer. The Great Muppet Caper, 1981, is where the stories get genuinely wild. There's the underwater Miss Piggy synchronized swimming sequence, which took roughly a week to shoot. There's Beauregard's taxi crash through a balsa wood door in London, with Goelz, Henson, and Frank Oz all crammed onto the floor of the back seat, operating puppets through a stunt none of them could fully see coming. "I hope he hits it," someone quipped on set. "He's going pretty fast." And there's a helicopter shoot in Albuquerque for the film's opening balloon sequence, a level of physical production most people don't associate with a Muppet movie at all. Looking back, though, Goelz has been candidly critical of the film's constant fourth wall breaking, calling it, in his own later assessment, smug and awkward. The Muppets Take Manhattan, 1984, gave Goelz the role of Bill, an advertising agency frog who speaks in a deliberate parody of Jim Henson's own voice as Kermit, an in-joke Henson himself apparently found funny. Goelz was less charitable about the film as a whole, later describing it as essentially a restatement of the Muppet movie, but not as heartfelt. A Muppet Family Christmas, 1987, holds a specific kind of significance. Until the 2012 Carnegie Hall concert, it was the only production where every character was performed all at once by their original performer, a one-time reunion that never quite happened again in the same way. Then there's The Muppet Christmas Carol, 1992, Goelz's stated favorite film in the entire franchise. Here, of every character available to the production, Gonzo is the one handed the role of Charles Dickens himself, the narrator carrying the story. It was writer Jerry Juhl's idea, a way to use Dickens's original prose without needing a distanced, disconnected narrator voice. Rizzo was written in as his sidekick specifically to keep the device from feeling too solemn. The film means enough to Goelz personally that by his own account he still can't watch it without crying, largely because of its redemption story, and there's a quieter tribute buried inside it that most audiences have never noticed. Goelz invented a minor background character, Richmond the horse, as a private dedication to fellow performer Richard Hunt, who died in 1992. The horse was named after him, given Hunt's distinctive gap-toothed look, and this is the detail worth sitting with. Goelz reportedly corresponded off-set, in character, with director Brian Henson lobbying for more screen time for a horse nobody in the audience would ever know was a memorial. A planned Bunsen and Beaker duet, Room in Your Heart, was ultimately cut from the finished film. After that, Muppet Treasure Island, 1996, Goelz's self-described second favorite film in the franchise. Muppets from Space, 1999, gets only a production context mention here. Its deeper thematic meaning for Gonzo already has its own video. Goelz stayed active through The Muppets, 2011, and Muppets Most Wanted, 2014, and continued as Zoot in The Muppets Mayhem on Disney Plus in 2023. Of The Muppets, 2011 specifically, Goelz has offered a memorable comparison. It felt, he said, like a love letter from a fan who didn't quite know the canon as intimately as the people who built it, respectful but never quite on the same level as the original Muppet movie. Honestly, that kind of blunt, unromantic self-criticism is rare in an industry built on nostalgia marketing. Goelz doesn't perform reverence for his own back catalog, he just tells you which films he thinks actually worked. Chapter 5. Fraggle Rock, the Heart of the Matter. The show that limited him the most, in the end, became the one that freed him the most. Boober Fraggle, anxious, doom forecasting, allergic to fun, was born out of an offhand comment Goelz made during the exhausting Muppet Show years about how he barely had time to worry about anything anymore except death and laundry. That comment became a character. Goelz has said he found the early work on Fraggle Rock creatively limiting at first, a children's format with its own built-in agenda, but that it eventually became, in his own word, therapeutic. A source of real personal growth, not just another job. He's also given the phenomenon a name of his own, the fleece ceiling. As long as Henson and Francoz operated as television's most bankable, most tightly synced performing duo, dominating every project they touched, the rest of the Muppet performers had limited room to develop. Fraggle Rock, where Henson was consumed by the Dark Crystal and Oz was increasingly focused on directing, was for the first time a space where the rest of the ensemble could actually grow into leading roles. Goelz also played the side-bottom sketches, where he performed two characters at once in the same conversation using blue screen technique under director Eric Till, a genuinely demanding piece of split performance work that rarely gets discussed outside hardcore fan circles. Then there's Uncle Traveling Matt, whose postcard segments came out of close collaboration with writer Jerry Jewell, who, as an ongoing, deliberately affectionate joke, kept assigning Goelz's character to increasingly unpleasant filming locations: a garbage dump, a chicken coop, a pen with a 700-pound pig, a roller coaster ridden 13 times in a row for a single segment. Goelz was also given real input into the character's development, including the idea of persistent denial as a running gag. By his own account, his best creative chemistry on the whole show was with fellow performer Steve Whitmire, a partnership, Wembley and Boober especially, built on what Goelz describes as an almost wordless mutual anticipation, the kind of chemistry that only comes from years of shared timing. Even decades later, during the 2020 pandemic-era revival Fraggle Rock, Rock On, Goelz stayed involved, recording voice work for Boober and Traveling Matt remotely, while colleague Karen Prell operated the puppets in his place, a genuine act of professional trust. Goelz himself connected the moment directly to Henson's own philosophy: new technology, new problem, creative solution. That's a theme that just runs consistently throughout his career. He carried that ethos into Fraggle Rock, Back to the Rock, on Apple TV Plus starting in 2022, where he remained active as Boober and Traveling Matt and also served as a co-executive producer. Chapter 6. Dark Crystal and Labyrinth. Two characters, same film. One meant almost nothing to him, the other meant almost everything. In The Dark Crystal, 1982, Goelz played both Fizzgig, the small, ferocious, entirely non-verbal pet creature, and Skekung, the Gartham Master, one of the film's central villains. Looking back, Goelz has been strikingly candid about the difference. Fizzgig, he said, offered essentially no real character development for a role like that and just a visual gag with teeth. The Gartham Master was different. Goelz has drawn a direct line between that role and his own brief military service, plus, oddly enough, memories of executive walkthroughs from his old design job at Hewlett-Packard, a performance built out of two completely unrelated pieces of his own biography, fused into a puppet most casual fans barely register as his work at all. This is the same conscientious objector history flagged all the way back in Chapter 1. It finally pays off here, in a character who spends the entire film wielding exactly the kind of institutional authority Goelz had personally walked away from. He returned to similar territory decades later, playing Bafi, a Fizzgig-like creature, in The Dark Crystal, Age of Resistance on Netflix in 2019. Labyrinth, 1986, gave him Sir Didymus, the small, fiercely honor-bound Fox Knight, performed with actor David Shaughnessy providing the voice and David Barclay co-puppeteering. Goelz has described the overall set atmosphere on Labyrinth as noticeably more serious, less playful than what he was used to on Henson's other projects. There's one specific anecdote worth sitting with. For an elaborate, technically demanding bridge scene with Didymus, Goelz brought his own camping chair and a music stand to the set to prepare, and then delivered the entire 3-page scene in just 3 takes. The assistant director's reported reaction afterward: "What else do you need here? How about a margarita?" Chapter 7. The Forgotten Corners. Not every character he's played became famous. Some, even the most dedicated fans, have never heard of. There's Digit from the Jim Henson Hour, 1989, and a never quite established character called the International Chill. There's Randy Pig, Bill the Bubble Guy, and Gary Cowenga, a ventriloquist's dummy abandoned by his own ventriloquist 40 years earlier. All from Muppets Tonight, 1996 to 98. There's a brief run of facial animation work for Earl Sinclair on Dinosaurs, 1991 to 94. There's Rugby Tiger and Ditz from The Secret Life of Toys, 1993. There's Stinky the Skunk on Jim Henson's Animal Show, 1994 to 98. And from that same show, one of the strangest little footnotes in his entire career, a puppet called Dave the Human, a literal puppet likeness of Goelz himself, performed by fellow puppeteer Bill Beretta, who reportedly nailed Goelz's own signature "yeah" gesture in the process. That puppet, by all accounts, still sits on a shelf in Goelz's own house today. He also picked up occasional guest work on Sesame Street itself over the years, small one-off character appearances, including a dinosaur character named Dr. Doug. It's a minor footnote compared to his Muppet Show workload, and there isn't much documented about it beyond the credit itself. But it closes a small loop worth noticing. The show that first pulled his attention toward puppetry as a career back in 1972 was also, decades later, one more place he quietly showed up to work. There's Jack the Dog in a 2-part bear in the Big Blue House Christmas special, Tiny the Giant Chicken in The Adventures of Elmo in Grouchland, 1999, Chip the IT Guy on the 2015 Muppets TV series, and Mr. Caterpillar on the Netflix series Ask the Storybots in 2018. A lot of viewers only ever ask one question about Goelz: what does he do when he's not Gonzo? This chapter is basically the answer, so 50-year sideline of odd, half-remembered characters that never made it onto a lunchbox, performed with exactly the same craftsmanship as the ones that did. Chapter 8. After Henson. When the man who gave him his entire career died, Goelz had to decide what to carry forward. At some point, after Jim Henson's death in 1990, Goelz took over performing Waldorf. The exact year remains genuinely unclear across sources, so we won't pretend to a precision that doesn't exist here. What is clear is that as Frank Oz increasingly turned his attention toward directing, Goelz became one of the load-bearing figures holding the ensemble together. His account of Henson's memorial service, held at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, is genuinely one of the most striking things in the entire archive of Muppet history. In the week before the ceremony, the workshop built hundreds of butterflies which were distributed at the entrance. During the memorial itself, those butterflies floated above a crowd of roughly 5,000 mourners inside the cathedral. Goelz has said that in that specific moment, it became clear to him that the entire shared body of work he'd spent nearly 2 decades on had been, in his own words, a spiritual journey. At the family's request, Goelz sang "I'm Going to Go Back There Someday," the same song from the Muppet movie, at the memorial. He said that was the first time he felt he could truly sing it properly, because by then he'd grown enough as a person to carry what the song was actually about. Then, in 2016, the puppetry industry honored Goelz himself with a gala called Puppets for Puppetry, a benefit for the Center for Puppetry Arts, held deliberately on the date that would have been Jim Henson's 80th birthday. Frank Oz, Matt Vogel, and Kermit appeared by video. In the room were Brian, Lisa, Cheryl, and Heather Henson, along with fellow performers Karen Prell and Bill Beretta. For the finale, Gonzo performed "I'm Going to Go Back There Someday" once more, this time alongside Rolf, Red Fraggle, and in a genuinely unexpected crossover, Ray Toro of My Chemical Romance. Hold on to that date. 10 years later, in 2026, it comes back around, and this time it's about him. Chapter 9. Beyond the Puppet. Sometimes a character doesn't need a puppet anymore, just a voice. Goelz currently voices Figment, the small purple dragon at the center of Epcot's Journey into Imagination attraction, a role he took over after original performer Billy Barty. And there's a small, genuinely charming Pixar in-joke worth knowing. In Inside Out 2015 and its 2024 sequel, Goelz voices a character called Subconscious Guard Frank, working alongside Frank Oz, who voices a character named, of all things, Dave. Goelz plays Frank. Oz plays Dave. Nobody involved has ever fully explained whether that swap was accidental or entirely deliberate, and honestly, that ambiguity is part of the charm. Chapter 10. The Man Behind It. In the end, none of this is really about puppets. It's about what a man builds out of never quite belonging in the first place. Goelz has been married to his wife Deborah since 1992 and has 2 children. He's also spoken openly about starting therapy around the age of 40. His own disclosure, not something we're reading into. His most frequently quoted description of his own creative process doubles, by the end of a career like this, as something close to a personal philosophy. I have a theory on how I develop characters. I try to look for a character flaw within myself, and then I find a way to amplify it and make it lovable. Asked about his legacy, his answer wasn't about puppets at all. I'll be fulfilled if I was a good dad. Asked which of his characters he's most like personally, he didn't hesitate. Actually, it's Gonzo, because I can ad-lib the easiest with him. He's untethered. And looking back at how a former industrial designer ended up spending 50 years inside puppets built to make people laugh, his own summary is almost dismissively modest. I had absolutely no credentials for show business whatsoever, except being a silly person. It was just a fluke that I wound up doing this. There's one more detail worth including here. Not a quote from Goelz, but about him. By his own account, Henson had a specific, recurring way of talking him into the show's most emotionally difficult scenes. Oh no, it'll be great, it'll be really nice. Not a note, not a directive, just quiet, patient reassurance from a man who apparently never once had to raise his voice to get what he wanted out of a nervous performer standing in front of a camera he still didn't fully trust himself in front of. Chapter 11. 2026, The Circle Closes. 10 years before he turned 80 himself, the industry honored him on Jim Henson's 80th birthday. In 2026, Dave Goelz turned 80. 50 years after Henson handed him a sad-eyed puppet from a box and said 4 words, Goelz remains the last original core Muppet performer from the Muppet Show, still actively performing his characters on a regular basis. Which finally brings us back to that photograph, the one hanging in his house. Dave Goelz, Gonzo, and Peter Sellers in full Inspector Clouseau costume. Sellers reportedly told Goelz directly that he felt a real connection between Gonzo and his own Clouseau. 2 characters convinced against all evidence that they were succeeding, failing constantly, loudly, and in public, and somehow never once losing the audience's affection along the way. That's not a bad description of Goelz's own career either. So how does a man who once designed airplane cabins for a living become 50 years later the only person who has never lost his own Muppet? Not through a company decision, not through a health scare, not through death, not through 50 years of corporate turnover at one of the most recast franchises in television history. He just kept showing up. Decade after decade, character after character, take after take, the same way he learned to say one simple word back in a cold studio in 1976, until eventually, somehow, it landed.